Hi, folks. It sounds pretty impressive when you describe it like that. I hope I can live up to the promise. So yeah, I'm Emmet. I am Director of Product Design at Intercom. Super quick intro if you don't know us. We build a platform and series of products for businesses to message and communicate with their customers. We have a pretty big office here in Dublin, one in San Francisco, and one in London that we opened last year. And I'll touch on some Intercom stuff, but first of all, before I get into that, I really wanted to tee up the kind of theme that I want to address here today. So I think, like, with a mixed crowd like this, you know, different roles, you often have people coming to talks or whatever it might be with different expectations, but I think that on some fundamental level, whether you're like a designer or an engineer or a researcher or a PM or whatever else it might be, I think a lot of us here probably just consider ourselves at some kind of basic level to be makers. Just people who build stuff. That's kind of how I think about my role anyway. And what I really wanted to hone in on today is one aspect that is pretty common universally to all maker types, and that is our use of tools. All of us have this really fundamental relationship with the tools that we use. This isn't going to be like a deep design, nerdy, like Sketch versus Figma talk. In fact, it's about kind of broadening the definition a little bit about tools and getting everyone to reflect a bit on the tools that they use. Especially the more I've grown into my role as a design leader, the tools that I use are pretty different to the tools that I would have used when I was more focused just on my own work. And also I've just kind of become interested, kind of fascinated really with how we as an industry think and talk about and engage with tools. So that's it. That's the preamble. To begin with, I'm going to start pretty simple. If you ask most people what a tool is, they would probably pick something like this. They would probably think of a hammer or a wrench or a saw or whatever it is. And traditionally and generally in the real world outside of our little bubble, I think people think about tools as kind of like any kind of machinery that augments your physical capability. So it's an augmentation of your physical abilities. But in fact, and that's true. That's like, of course, tools do that. But really, there's been a long line of progression, I think, from these pretty standard basic tools that augment your physical capabilities all the way up to the most modern tools that we use today and that we might think about in this software or design kind of context. And I think this is actually pretty well and famously illustrated in what is perhaps the most single famous cut in cinematic history. This, of course, is 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick. And in this, there's a cut that happens in a second from the bone to the space station, boom, and it's making this point in the film, and the film generally makes this point, I think, that the tools that we use are like a defining characteristic all the way through from the very earliest glimmers of humanity to the farthest we can think of in the future. There's some fundamental relationship between humans and the tools that we use. And in many ways, these two tools are like bookending this very long timeline of tools that we make and build and use. And in some sense, I think that almost all of the work that we do engages with the tools along this timeline in some sense, right? So that's a super broad definition of what you might think a tool to be. So let's narrow it down a bit. This is a pencil, obviously. This also, if you ask me, is a tool. But whereas before, the tools we were looking at were ones that augment your physical abilities, this one actually augments your intellectual capabilities. So to illustrate that point, I could probably ask most of you like a simple maths problem and you'd be able to do it in your head, but if I ask you a more complicated one, like whatever, what's the square root of 200 times 57, you wouldn't be able to do it in your head. But then if I give you this really simple piece of technology, just like wood pulp and graphite and a piece of paper maybe to go with it, you'd probably be able to work out the answer pretty quickly. And so this tool, this very basic piece of technology really, has augmented your intellectual capabilities massively. It's expanded your intellectual horizon almost. So, what does this have to do with design, which is the area that I operate in? Well, I think it's really interesting to think about the design of this tool. This is an extremely simple tool, and you might think of the design of being somewhat self-evident. But there are other ways of designing tools like this. For example, if I gave you like this version of a pencil and I asked you to repeat that same exercise, you'd probably have a hard time. I bet you wouldn't complete it, right? You'd like give up in frustration, or you'd just really struggle with the mechanics of it, which is important when you really think about it, because it means that for this category, this important category of tools on which we rely to augment our intellect, the physical ergonomics, the interaction design of the thing still really matters. And actually, if the interaction design is a bit shit, it means that it's actually going to reduce that intellect, like the ceiling of the intellectual capability that the tool can expand you to, if that makes sense. Now, what's really, really interesting about this photo, I think, is that it was actually created to illustrate this point. This photo is from a 1962 report that was published by a guy called Doug Engelbart. This is the report. The report is called Augmenting Human Intellect, a Conceptual Framework. And it was part of a wider project that Engelbart was working on in the 60s in the Stanford Research Institute. He was working on a project called NLS for Online System, and that project culminated a few years after the report in 1968, December 8, 1968, in what has become known since as the mother of all demos. So this is a video from the demo that evening in 1968, and it's so notable and it's known as the mother of all demos because it introduced to the world for the very first time the very first versions of loads of tools and technologies that we know of today. It was the first appearance of the mouse, of collaborative text editing, of version control, of hypertext, of real-time video conferencing. All these kinds of things were presented for the first time here. It's like the greatest tech demo that you've probably never seen, if you've never seen it. What's also interesting is that this is kind of considered the birth or the beginning of the modern software era. It was the start of tools that became accessible to normal people. But I think it was also the beginning, in many ways, of an obsession that has persisted and been prevalent really in Silicon Valley and in the Bay Area and in our wider industry here as well to this day. And that obsession that has remained, I think, is an obsession with tools, or the idea of building tools, and that being a valuable and a noteworthy thing. So the guy behind the camera, the video operator for this demo, was a guy called Stuart Brand, who, among other things, published a magazine at the time called the Whole Earth Catalog. These are some spreads from the catalog. So it was a magazine, and it was kind of a how-to guide. It was aimed at like back to the land hippie types who were moving from cities like San Francisco back to communes to build their own versions of society or whatever. And it highlighted all kinds of tools and techniques that they could use for building this new kind of self-sufficient lifestyle. There's some mad stuff in there. You should check it out. The cover of the Whole Earth catalog featured the tagline, which was access to tools. So remember, this is San Francisco, 1968, and if you know anything about that period, you'll know that it was a time where this kind of hippie counterculture style of thinking was very much intersecting and overlapping with the birth of the modern personal computer. Same time, same place, these same two things were coming out of the same areas, and a lot of the ideas and philosophies and even people kind of commingled and co-influenced across between these two groups. Steve Jobs, who would have been on the scene at the time, later called the Whole Earth Catalog, like Google in paperback form. 35 years before Google came along, it was idealistic and overflowing with neat tools and notions. And in fact, you can actually see the influence of the Whole Earth Catalog on how Jobs thought and spoke throughout his entire career about like his belief system and his attitude toward technology. I feel like at this stage there should be a content warning for showing like Steve Jobs quotes at design conferences, but I'm not going to read through the quotes because that's not really the point. I'm just going to say, like, in 1985, in his little-known stripy jumper era, he was talking about, you're giving people tools that encourage them to be creative. Computers are tools. In 1989, the mullet years, he's talking about people are tool builders. The computer is the most remarkable tool. Several years later, again, in 1994, his grizzly hipster kind of vibe going on here. I'm a tool builder. I want to build really good tools. People are basically good and smart. Just give them access to tools and nice things will happen. And then perhaps most famously, throughout his career, this one is from 1990, his famous kind of bicycle for the mind parable, I guess you would call it, which is as close, I think, as he ever came to like a unified theory of Steve Jobs' opinion on technology. You've probably heard it. I won't go into the whole thing here, but he's talking about, humans are tool builders. We can fashion tools that amplify these inherent abilities. So it's that augmentation theme, right? And so for him, the metaphor for this is a computer has always been a bicycle for the mind. Now, I bring up all of these examples not to be like, it's Steve Jobs and he is amazing, and so therefore it's validating like my point in this talk. Actually, kind of the opposite of that, in fact. I kind of bring this up and point out this pattern just to say that one of the most, in retrospect, culturally influential people in modern memory, like someone whose shadow loomed massively large over our industry and a lot of the work that has come out of it since, had this theme that he kept returning to again and again and again. It wasn't just a flight of fancy for him. It was something that over years and decades he kept returning to. And so it obviously drove him. It probably influenced a ton of other people. And so maybe it's worth interrogating that a bit and trying to figure out like what that actually means about our shared attitude and culture around technology. Because although like it's all very inspiring, kind of nerd motivational poster stuff, right? These quotes, in some way there is an element to what, with the benefit of hindsight, I think, of like disavowal or separating yourself and saying, look, we just build the tools, man. We don't care what people do with them. Tools are tools, and people do with them what they will. And I think what we've seen in the last few years in the technology industry especially is that that's not really a good enough answer anymore. I think like it's incumbent upon people who make tools to now think about how those tools might be used or abused or misused or whatever it might be. What those like repercussions, those second-order effects might be. And I think it's important to highlight that because we still see this kind of attitude prevailing today. So Zuck was up in front of Congress, whatever it was, a couple of months ago, and in his pre-written testimony, he talked about, he used the word tool or tools 11 times in just the little preamble, and then absolutely scattered throughout his actual spoken testimony where he was being like grilled by the senators. He just kept coming back to it again and again. If you just like check out the transcript, these tools, those tools, 13 times he mentioned AI tools. So this really like just gets me wondering like, what's the deal here? Why this like obsession that seems to persist over a long period of time with tools? I think some of it is genuinely goes back to those kind of countercultural ideals that maybe started with the Whole Earth Catalog. Some of it might be the fact that it allows you to kind of distance yourself from the messy reality of what the tool gets used for, and so it's kind of a hands-off approach. But fundamentally, I think people focus on tools a lot and think and talk about them and valorize them is because tools are like levers for impact, and impact on the world and making a change in the world is a thing that's very much like celebrated in our industry. But I think what I'd really like to hone in on is the fact that, as I've maybe been hinting at already, these tools, if you're taking it upon yourself to build tools, they're not necessarily these neutral things. They do have a pretty big influence on the work that's being produced with them. They even have an influence in some cases, in many cases, on the physical world. I thought this was like completely fascinating, right? So apparently, the CTO of Autodesk said, I can walk through a building and I can tell you which version of AutoCAD was used to design it. That's crazy, right? Like the architect is sitting there thinking like, I am the maker, I am the creator. This, idea and vision is coming from me. But I think it's very true that in a lot of cases, the tools that we use through suggesting their own use to us as makers, as designers or makers, whatever it is, are influencing, whether we know it or not, the output. And this definitely isn't just the case with architects. It's the case with like what I imagine most of us here are software people as well. And I think I can kind of demonstrate this by showing you how the tools that we have used, assuming most of us are like digital software design type people, how the tools that we have used have actually driven a whole bunch of trends. And so come with me on a short lesson through the history of web design. A lot of early web design looked like this. A lot of early software design for the internet more broadly looked like this. Websites were designed, as we would probably say today, in the browser, which is to say that we didn't have this process of designing some static representation like a mock-up or a prototype and then handing that for implementation. A lot of these design decisions happened on the fly as they were being built. That was around 1996. A few years later, people started using these photo editing tools, things like Photoshop, in combination with other tools like, say, Dreamweaver. And so what you could do is draw the static picture in Photoshop and then use Dreamweaver to slice it up into lots of crazy table combinations or image maps and create something that looked like this. So the tools were suggesting new possible directions. The commonly used tools, which was Photoshop for a long time, started to suggest new styles. So this might have been the late 90s. The brush tool and layering tools allowed you to do lots of pixel-style things. So that became a really popular trend for a while. Photoshop got more powerful brushes, where you could do lots of textures and layering. And so this grunge style was very popular on the web for a long time. Then Flash came along, and of course, totally not influenced by Flash. Everyone decided having a crazy animation at the start of your website was important. Not the case at all, right? The tool suggested to people that they should do these big intros and crazy rollover transitions and so on. And then finally, into the Web 2.0 type era, where things like gradient and modeling features in newer versions of Photoshop started to become available. You can see those coming out here. And then finally, reaching its zenith, I guess, and maybe subsequent demise in so-called skeuomorphic design, and finally flattening out to the prevailing aesthetic of today as we moved from these more raster photo editing type tools to Photoshop to this newer generation of design tools we use today, like Sketch, which are way more vector oriented. And so you open Photoshop and it suggests to you subtly, right, through little signals and the tools it makes available, hey, you should build layers and blend them together and get that grungy look. And Sketch doesn't do that at all. Sketch says you should draw boxes and layer those boxes and create drop shadows between them. But the tool really influences what you do with it and thus trends. There's a bit of a dance here. The tools are also responding to some emergent trends. But I think that for anyone who is at least interested in the idea of pushing their craft forward a bit or trying new things, and at least some of us should be, I think we should come to these tools somewhat skeptical. Come to Sketch and realize I could do a grunge style design here, but I'm never going to. It would almost be like solving the maths problem with the brick, right? It's so unergonomic to do it with that particular tool that I'm not even really going to end up doing that. And so what we end up with is a load of websites or products or apps that kind of look like this instead, right? None of them offensive, right? All look pretty nice. All individually, you would have no problem with them. But taken as a whole, I think highlights the danger here, which is there's the possibility that our tools kind of railroad us a little bit too much, and we end up with like a design monoculture almost. So yeah, I mean, think about what these tools are suggesting to you somewhat quietly, and don't let them push you around. The last thing to kind of make it maybe a bit more practical is to talk about another way that I really think about tools, and that is the tools that we use to like run our team. And I think the way that this most often manifests, at least when I'm talking to people, is in this question that people ask all the time, which is like, what's your process? What's your product process? What's your design process? The idea being like that some other group has got it figured out and you just need to latch on or maybe adopt some of what their process is and everything's going to be totally grand. And I actually do try and like connect with other design leaders in the industry and ask them this question. And the really good thing that I take from that is that like a lot of other people are dealing with the exact same problems that we're dealing with, and in short, it's kind of like a bit of a shit show for them as well, which is incredibly reassuring. So like I hear these same things from all sorts of people. It varies depending on like what stage that you're at as a company and what you value and so on. But like a lot of these things are problems that come back to how your process is set up. And the interesting thing is that we all seem to somehow need to like, there's no one-size-fits-all solution to these problems. We all seem to have the same problems, but we seem to need to invent our own independent solutions. Everyone is like struggling in isolation going, what are the tools that I need to build for my team that helps us solve some of these process problems? And what I have discovered is that if choosing like a design tool really influences the output of your work, choosing like a specific process really influences like a whole bunch of people's work and can have a massive like impact, and sometimes that impact is not necessarily what you would have had in mind. So the same thing applies where, you know, the tool you choose can influence your output even at this kind of process level. So yeah, process is a tool. It's the main tool that you have if you're someone like me in a like design leadership role, or I would suggest like a product leadership role as well. And so I wanted to, for the last section here, to talk a bit about process. My own kind of philosophy around how to tackle this at Intercom, after realizing, you know, through many kind of false starts where it was like, we just need to get our process locked in and then we'll be in a good place and things can just run. And it took me a long time to realize that like, we're just one step away from being finished was absolutely the wrong mentality to adopt when it comes to putting a process in place. And in fact, my approach was way more influenced by actually the way Toyota approached their car manufacturing assembly line process. So, like, long story short, the Japanese and the Americans were in a kind of a trade war of sorts about who could win the car economy, essentially, globally. And the prevailing wisdom that was like the most optimized process for building a car was the one that was going to win. So take the existing assembly line process and like turn up the Taylorism dial to the max and just get every last drop of efficiency out as you could. And Toyota kind of changed this model in a very subversive and unexpected way. They said, hey, if anyone on the line, instead of us telling you what to do, and that's the process, and just do it as fast as you can and shut up and stay quiet about it, there's like literally a big red button on the line. And if you see something wrong or that can be optimized, you hit the button and we'll stop the line. And now, again, like the frame of mind was keep the line moving as fast as possible. So this stopping the line is very counterintuitive initially. But they realized that sometimes you need to let people stop the line, change something about how the whole process works, and then start again. And in the long run, that's going to win you greater efficiencies. Okay, they call this approach Kaizen. Don't know if anyone here like reads kanji. Kai meaning change, and Zen meaning good. So essentially, change for the better, change for the good, or like continuous improvement. That's the philosophy here. And so taking this approach as inspiration and realizing that we were never going to be done, that it was this process of continuous improvement in terms of our work as a team and how we approach our process, we started something internally that we called Project Kaizen. And it's kind of this project where we will, driven by members of the team, figure out how to improve our process on an ongoing basis. No more this idea that one more tweak and we'll finally be done and we can get onto something else. So we set this up and we ran it exactly like we run projects at Intercom. Because it's an ongoing thing. This is maybe somewhat boring, but I think people don't go into the spreadsheety reality of work all too often. Us running it as a project at Intercom means that we have a roadmap with problem statements. We have got cycle goals. We work in 6-week cycles. We break those down to weekly goals. And so running it like a project, we have a backlog of things that we're not going to do now, but we might get into in future. Running it like a project allowed us to think of it as a thing that won't be finished. Like our products that we build, we don't think of them as something that'll be finished. We're actually into this mindset of iterative design all the time. It's like a rolling thing. And I think we need to think about our process and our tools that we use as something very similar. So we did this, we were running for a while, and then someone kind of went, hey, this whole Kaizen thing, isn't that essentially design ops? And we were like, oh shit, yeah, it is, actually. So we kind of invented design ops without knowing it, but have since changed the name to be this because it's a more generally understood phrase for what it is. If you haven't heard of it, it was a phrase that I only really encountered, I guess, sometime last year. Teams like Airbnb and Pinterest are really leading the charge here, and they're at the forefront of establishing it as an actual function and a role within design teams. And these are essentially staffed, full-time members of the design team, and their job is to continually improve how the team works, improve efficiency, improve how we operate. And all the problems that I had up on the board earlier, a lot of those are opportunities for someone who works in design ops to solve, right? So stuff like our team processes, our rituals, the software that we use, how we do recruiting, how we do onboarding, training, org design, resourcing, all this kind of stuff that honestly takes a ton of time from people who are also trying to ship product and do other things. It really allows them to focus on it, and then they also have horizontal across the team kind of remit to make some of these changes. Yeah, so essentially what it's about is maintaining, in the broadest sense of the word, the tools that we use, both the software tools, but also the processes, the rituals, all that other stuff. And I'm kind of personally delighted to see this becoming a part of design teams. I think it's one of the grungiest things that we struggle with, and it isn't the thing that we write Medium articles about or show to the world. It's not part of the tip of the iceberg that the outside of the world gets to see. It's the under the iceberg stuff. And I think it's just an opportunity for us to get a bit more mature and organized and operationally minded about how we do design work, and therefore more efficient. And the ultimate thing here is to bring it back to enable everyone to build their own products, build their own tools, whatever it is that they're building, and be more effective in that regard. So yeah, I would kind of urge you to think about subverting and replacing a lot of the tools that you rely on today. Don't get stuck in some dogmatic mode of thinking, well, this is the way that we've done it. Any team that's growing and changing, by definition, the way you work needs to grow and change as well. Otherwise, you're going to become obsolete very quickly. I guess some final thoughts, back to the broader theme of tools. We, as humans, as big hairless apes, we're somewhat limited creatures. You can exercise all you want, but there's some natural limit to how naturally strong you're going to be. But use a tool, and you can, augment your physical capabilities exponentially. You can sit down and think, or you can study, or you can talk all you want. But fundamentally, or for some measure of intelligence, you're never going to be as intelligent as any regular person equipped with a smartphone, right? For some measure of intelligence, at least. And so I think we as makers of tools and as users of tools, we have this incredible opportunity to expand our capabilities, but we also have a responsibility to think about, if I'm making a tool, how is it going to get used? If I'm a user of a tool, how is that influencing the work that I do? And yeah, don't be afraid to throw out old tools and come up with new ones. It's an incredible way of getting you to think about a problem from a new angle. And really, in the long history of humans and their relationship with technology, casting aside old tools and adopting new ones has fundamentally always been where progress has come from. So that can't be a bad sign. That's it. Here's my socials and stuff. If you want the slides for any of the quotes or whatever, you can drop me an email and I'll send them to you. Thanks very much.
Great. Great, thanks, Emmet. We're going to be setting up the chairs for the panel next, but I think we have time for a couple questions. Anybody have a question for Emmet? Yeah, right here in the front. Yeah, they'll bring a mic over to you.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Graham. I'm a designer at IBM. I guess one question I had was, with the idea of that sort of design ops team, have you found any, I guess, sort of like pushback maybe from the rest of the design team members, where if you're sort of centralizing this idea of like, okay, here's the people who are responsible for improving our process, how have the rest of the design team responded to that? So I think with the Toyota example, each individual worker was sort of empowered to kind of flag an issue they saw. But if you have like another team who's kind of saying, well, this is actually the way you should be working, like how have you found that response?
Totally, yeah. That's a really important thing that I probably should have addressed in my talk. So the short answer is like, it's highly important that this person is a conduit for what the team actually wants, right? And they're responsive to it. So that's why the Kaizen example is about like, it comes from the team. How we do that at Intercom, how we model that, we don't have a big red button. We have, twice a year, we run a company-wide survey. So 600 and something people now in the company get this survey. And it's basically prompting everyone for like, hey, how are we doing? What's working? What's not? What would you change? What do you want the leaders to know about? Like, it's quite broad, and we collate all of that feedback, and we break it down by like department. We break it down by everything. We break it down by gender. We break it down by location. All this kind of stuff. And so then, as like a design leader, I can see what are the pain points for my group. What are the stuff that they're saying? What worked for us when we were like 15 people is starting to break for us a bit now that we're pushing 20, things like that. And so that gives us the ability to react with that. And basically all of this stuff is done in collaboration with the teams. So the design ops person is more of a facilitator than like a, dictator. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Emmet. You're going to be around at the break?
Yes.
So if you have more questions for Emmet, he'll be around at the break. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.